Well, it is midwinter and year 3 of the pandemic. Feelings of exhaustion and anxiety have been real for so many of us as the months drag on. But for some, they may have noticed there's a different type of fatigue we're experiencing now, a phenomenon psychologists are calling resilience fatigue. For more insight on this, we're joined by Dr. Vaile Wright, a clinical psychologist and researcher at the American Psychological Association. Thanks for speaking with us today, Dr. Wright.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so since the start of the pandemic, there's been this consistent underlying tiredness, but it appears to have evolved over time. What exactly is resilience fatigue?
Resilience fatigue is this feeling of exhaustion that comes from the efforts of having to cope and manage prolonged stress over a long period of time, in this case, over 2 years. Many people are doing their best to be resilient, but with no end in sight, I think people are just kind of over it.
All right, and the finish line keeps moving. I think we're told, okay, just a couple months, and if we get to this point, we'll be okay, but that keeps getting pushed back, so I'm sure that's part of it. What are some of the common stressors of resilience fatigue to be aware of?
So some of the things to be thinking about is the ways in which our stress impacts both us physically and emotionally. So physically, we would expect things like muscle tension, teeth grating, headaches, stomach aches. Emotionally, we become angry and frustrated, maybe even hopeless. And at the worst, it's a loss of empathy. Empathy for others, empathy for those around us. And that empathy is really critical, especially right now. And so making sure that we're building ourselves back up is critically important.
All right, and Dr. Wright, what else can people do differently sort of this time around, this wave of fatigue, to address pandemic resilience fatigue, but in a healthy way?
So there's always individual factors that we need to keep in mind, like making sure we're eating healthy, getting enough sleep, but we also need to look at our environments around us. Can we talk to our employer and make some changes to really support our mental health? Can we look at how things are happening within our family and ensure that we're asking for the support that we need, that people are all sharing the types of tasks that need to occur on a daily basis? So it's about individual factors and our environment.
All right, now what's been very interesting, I think, to see over the course of the pandemic is that people's fatigue is manifesting in very different ways. Some are out in big crowds, surrounded by strangers, protesting the public health restrictions, while others are still holed up at home. Everyone is frustrated, obviously, by the pandemic, but there seems to be this divide in society right now about how to respond to it. It's almost as if you're either on one side or the other. So what are some of the reasons for these two very different reactions to the pandemic?
There's probably a variety of reasons. Certainly one is the polarization that we're seeing across the country, both within our communities, but even within our families, of how we're taking a different approach to maybe managing our own individual decision-making during the pandemic. But I think what we're also seeing now is a focus away from just what individuals need to do to stop the pandemic to looking at the ways in which our systems have actually failed us. And I think that's where you're seeing so much of this anger and frustration coming out when we see things like supply chain or the mental health crisis, systems that we've come to rely on not being able to meet the demand of our current situation.
All right, and any advice or tools that you would say to a patient of yours or someone who comes to you for help to just try and get through sort of this last mile that we're, seeing the end in sight, and also maybe to even be able to bridge a gap between someone who has a different view from ourselves about the pandemic?
Yeah, there's a few things. One is to remember to focus on what's in your control, because things are so uncertain, continue to be, and that can make us feel a loss of control. So focusing on that is important. Reminding ourselves that it won't always be like this. The only constant in the world is change. And so the pandemic will likely come to an end, just as it has for human history as long as we've been. And then the last thing would be to really put our judgment out the door, to stop judging ourselves, to stop judging others for the ways in which people may be handling things differently than you are. It's not the way that we're going to get to the end of the pandemic by judging each other. We really have to come together as a community.
All right, thank you so much for your time and advice today. We appreciate it. That's clinical psychologist Dr. Vaile Wright.